Hello there, sword fans. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. This is a katana from Jim Hrisoulas, or Salamander Armory, or Atar. It's synonymous with a few different names out there. But regardless, this is supposed to be a sword made by him. It's got his mark on it, and I did call Jim Hrisoulas and validated. He didn't see any photos, but he said if it's got that mark, it's his work. And it was sold to sword friend Landon, which brings me to the caveats I should mention. This is on loan from sword friend Landon, who very graciously sent me this sword to do this review. Now, I should talk about the story a little bit about how it came to me. Sword friend Landon asked me, what do you think of this manufacturer? As in Jim Hrisoulas, Atar. I said, I've seen photos that give me some sketch vibes. He offered to send it to me. He did. When I opened it, immediately it struck me as a Chinese-made sword. And thus, the meat and potatoes of this video. But that was the sense that came from this. I did note that, like, hey, things can be weird. Photos don't necessarily tell the whole story. Now that I have it in hand, I see a story and it doesn't line up with what is advertised in my brain. But that brings me to the next part. These are just my thoughts and opinions. I have no evidence apart from what I will suggest to you here and what I will show you. Hopefully it is logical and reasonable, but I do want to point out that I could be wrong. Jim Hrisoulas is supposedly a well-respected member of the community. I say supposedly because I've met people that have known him, read his books, that have spoken highly of him, other collectors that have had his things and thought highly of them. But it's my first experience, and you know, I've never met the man personally apart from a phone conversation that we had. So I also understand that he is an educated, he's got a PhD in something I believe related to this field. He's written books on the subject, and I am frankly out of my depth insinuating that this sword is made in a way that is not disclosed by this trusted member of community. But I'm calling a spade a spade. My thing is reviewing swords on YouTube and calling it like I see it, and I will do my best to explain why I think what I think in a way that is logical and reasonable, but I genuinely hope that I am wrong. And if I am, please tell me I'm crazy, tell me how, tell me, show me something that says I'm a crazy person and don't know my ass from a hole in the ground, because that, I think, is the best case scenario in this video. But regardless, these are my opinions. Take that for what it's worth. I should also note, where do these opinions come from? Maybe a little bit. Jim is, obviously I talked about his credential a little bit. I am a five-headed moron that talks about swords on the internet for some reasons. And more or less, I've had thousands of swords though, and a lot of them have been Chinese reproduction swords. And I've talked about swords on YouTube for a long time. And that puts me in kind of a unique position to say, like, this looks like what I commonly review, not something made in the United States, because I also happen to have had in my collection, in my person right now, in my personal collection, a number of swords made by American blacksmiths, which are obviously not necessarily going to be the same, but suggest that at least I have some hands-on experience with a number of other swords out there. So the next bit I should mention is I did have a conversation with Jim Hrisoulas. I called him and I asked him, why does this look like a Chinese-made sword? And he mentioned, you know, he doesn't know that there's only so many ways to make a sword. He does it his way, and I'd love for that to be true and for me to be crazy. However, throughout this video, I will attempt to present to you the reasons that I think it is likely a made-in-China piece marked up by 10 times and objectively worse than what you get if you had just bought it in China. Anyway, that's what I'm going to do in the video. Hopefully you find it interesting, and hopefully I'm wrong. Now, first I'm going to talk about the fittings, the Fuchi Kashra in particular. And Jim had mentioned that he doesn't make these things and that they are bought from another supplier. He mentioned that it's his friend and that he hand casts them. Now, these fittings are on another sword in my collection from the Sword Buyer's Guide. They were also on a different sword from Ryujin, I believe, some time ago. But these are not bespoke, one-of-a-kind, interesting fittings that are manufactured just for Jim by a friend. They are mass production fittings that are on a number of swords in Longchuan, China. They are from the parts bin, as I say often. They are not unique or special in any discernible way to me. And in fact, I have them on another sword, which is from a different manufacturer. And these are cast, as I understand it, in large swaths and batches. And that doesn't make them bad, but it doesn't make them unique, special, or what you would hope would be on your $3,000 sword, potentially. So just noting that the fittings themselves, the way Jim phrased it to me on the phone, did not seem entirely accurate, in the sense that these don't look like hand cast pieces, which implies to me that they're like wax molded, one of a kind, somewhat unique, but cast. These are just from the kind of standard parts bin. Maybe his friend is a mass manufacturer in Longchuan, China, or a reseller of these fittings that has some part in recasting them. I don't know, but they don't look crisper, better, and in some way unique or special. And it's important to note that the original fittings, some original manufacturer may be dealing with better molds, the original molds, the originals from, original templates that were cast from some, unique piece. And I just don't see that here. These look like the same thing that is on another katana, kind of line for line. The other sword, I've seen these on $300 swords, basically, where there's no discernible quality, craftsmanship, clarity difference in the casting whatsoever, at least not that I'm able to see. Now, the other furniture that he's mentioned is that, he's not making it, but the habaki looks like any other brass habaki that I've ever seen. And the tsuba is present on a Huawei sword that I have, again, a sword in the $300 price point, and I don't spot any discernible difference in the quality of the tsuba. It doesn't look like it's cut out by any different means, like it's patinated or painted by any different means. It looks like the same parts bin special that you would find on swords in the sub $300 category, or you well could find them on more than $300 swords, but just that the parts themselves are not inherently special or expensive or better than what you would find for, tens of dollars online. I'm going to talk about the Scabbard, and this is a little bit interesting and does color the situation a little bit, which I'll talk about thoughts kind of towards the end. But Jim did mention he doesn't make the Scabbard himself, that he paints it, but that the Scabbard is made elsewhere, which I will say, if you have a glove and you are making the hand to fit the glove, then naturally the hand has to be a certain size, which does explain some of what I'm going to talk about later in terms of the shape of the blade and how it fits and all that. However, I would say that while he's saying he's not making the wood parts and doing some painting, the painting looks objectively worse to me. And the fact that it looks like kind of Home Depot spray paint, it doesn't look like it's particularly thick, particularly durable, particularly special in any meaningful, unique way. It looks like a thing that I might be able to do, and I find myself pretty clumsy at these tasks. So it's not that it's blotchy or full of drips, but it does look amateurish. And if I contrast this with some of the scabbards that I have seen out of China, the lacquer work is usually better. It's thicker, it seems more resilient, more resistant to weather, more resistant to pings and dings and things like that. And this doesn't seem to be the case for me. So I'm under the impression that Jim gets the wood. It's probably all ground to shape and has all the embellishments in it, and that he's doing some paint. I just don't find the paint work to be particularly good. And when I say objectively worse, this is one of those parts. Conceivably, if you bought a $300 sword out of China, you could get a sword with the same kind of framework but different lacquer on it, and I would submit to you that lacquer work would be more durable and better looking than what is presented here on a sword that is, presumably around about $3,000-ish, or maybe you buy it on a deal for $1,000 or $1,500, but still, it seems like you could get as much or more on a Chinese-made sword for less money. Now I'm going to mention the ska, and that's the handle, the grip area, and Jim mentioned that he makes these himself. And I don't know if that's the case, but I believe some of what is mentioned here. One, the shape is more hourglass-like, but it gives me the impression that the handle may be carved elsewhere. Don't know for sure, but based on the materials, if I take it apart, if I look at it, the materials, the wood looks similar. So it gives me the impression maybe the core is what he starts with. But I do believe that he is wrapping it because it is perhaps the worst wrap that I've seen, and that I can move these around. I am hesitant to use this a single time, a single day for EI. Now, it is worth noting that this is secondhand. I believe sword friend Landon also bought it secondhand, so maybe it's gone through some temperature changes. Perhaps what Jim makes is much tighter than this, and this is not representative of his work. However, I've had a number of swords that have traveled across multiple hands, multiple hemispheres, multiple continents, and don't move like this and don't give me the impression that the sword is going to fall apart after a single use. I can, without this sword being used, I can pull the kasha and wiggle it around. It's going to fall apart and come untied if I use it for EI at all. At least that's the vibe it gives me, and I don't want to diminish sword friend Landon's sword and leave him with something that will need to be rewrapped and be a cost to him. But the knots move around, I can push them around, I can displace all of this with my hands. It is, on a $3,000 sword, the worst wrap, and it is a low bar. There was another $3,000 sword that came unwrapped and untied. It's not that I haven't seen bad wraps on $3,000 swords, but this absolutely and unequivocally, for me, is the worst wrap that I have seen on a $3,000 sword, and is a contender for the worst wrap I have ever seen on any sword, at least a katana, I should say, because I did have some handles that exploded in my hand. I'm looking at you, Alayubi, but this, for a katana, this is worse than the $50 Musashi sword that was sent to me. This is awful. So, Jim, if he is doing the wrap, then I would say that, like, throw lacquer on it, glue it together, do something, because this is dangerous for anyone to use. And as a sword that is intended to be functional, as this is a sharp blade, it's dangerous and not great. It's not great. I'm going to shut up about it, but I believe it may be his work because it's, again, makes the sword objectively worse than something that I would see in China, which already don't necessarily come with the highest end wraps, but usually they don't give me the impression they're going to fall apart soon. Sometimes they're a little loose. Sometimes I can push them around a bit if I apply pressure. Oftentimes I can, but seldom does it give me the impression that things are loose and won't stand a single use. That is unique to this one. Now I'm going to talk about the blade, the pointy stabby part, and it does have an interesting hamon on it. It's got a neat pattern on it. However, the hamon gets dangerously close to the edge, and so this is interesting because supposedly in the conversations I've had with Jim, he's a well-researched guy. He's looked at museum originals, and this is odd. I mean, it may be in a diminished blade, but it seems very strange that you would have edges that kind of roll very, very close to the, or differential hardening, the hamon that rides very, very close to the edge, where you're almost not providing any hardened material at the end of the blade. But suffice to say, this looks a lot like a Chinese sword. It looks like it in shape, which can kind of be pushed aside by the fact that you're making a sword to fit a scabbard that exists and was likely made elsewhere, presumably in China. But there are other things. The way the bohi terminates, not ahistoric, but not high-end, and also very similar to what I see on very cheaply made swords. The yakote, the polish on the blade, is done in basically like a grind that's done the other way. It's not necessarily traditional, but commonly seen in inexpensive reproductions. This hamon pattern is something that I have seen on swords in China. I believe I have one that is very similar to it. It's like a fiery wild pattern in a sword from a company called Yes Katana. The bohi looks like it has the similar kinds of undulations and kind of waviness that I commonly see in swords out of Longchuan. So lots of things on here give me the impression that this is a Chinese-made sword in terms of the shape, in terms of the hamon I see, in terms of the polish that I get, the way the bohi is terminated, the way the yakote is polished, and the overall shape. And again, I can excuse the shape given that it's supposed to fit in a glove that was made in China. So there's only so many shapes you could have, but there's a lot of different ways to skin the cat, so to speak. It could be any number of different shapes, profiles, and not mirror something that looks like it's made in China. The last bit, and perhaps the most telling, is the nakago, the tang of the sword. And a lot of times, swords made in Longchuan have a similar tang, and that's because, as I understand the manufacturing process there are a number, hundreds, maybe thousands of different smiths that are working for a lot of different resellers and manufacturers, and they sell the swords to basically fit in like a modular construction, meaning that somebody makes handles, somebody makes blades, somebody makes fittings, somebody makes scabbards, and different companies go and buy from other places and then combine them and resell them to you. But that means that the nakagos need to be roughly a standard shape. And so they tend to look very, very similar across a number of manufacturers. And that's exactly what I see here. Now, why is that telling? Why is that interesting or different? Well, every American blacksmith that I've seen, whether it be Howard Clark or Walter Sorrells or Rick Barrett or Josiah Boomershine or Anthony DiCristofano or Gabriel Bell or Michael Bell or any of the smiths that I've owned outside of Japan, or the smiths I've owned just in any custom-made manufacturer, has kind of unique shapes to their tanks, different grind lines, different file lines, and it's a part that a lot of people don't necessarily see, and they all look a little different. And you can usually look at a tang and say, I know who made this, and point to the way they do it, because that's kind of a fingerprint of the sword. There's a lot of fingerprints around the sword, but that is one in particular that stands out. This one looks like a sword out of Longchuan. It has vertical grind lines. It has the same general shape. It has the same end to the nakago that often happens. And it only looks like it's been taken under a grinder to have an 8R stamped in it to put Jim's name on it. It looks like somebody put whiteout over somebody else's name on homework and wrote their own name in and turned it in as their own. I'm kind of at a loss. One additional thing I'd like to note about my conversation with Jim is that he never dodged or avoided my questions, and he was always kind and gracious with his time. Now, bear in mind that I'm a stranger from the internet, asking about how his swords are made, what pieces are made where, and also asking kind of direct questions like, why does your sword look like one made in China? And while I can't say the answers changed my mind, I can say that he didn't dodge them, avoid them, and he never became unpleasant. And given the nature of my questions, I couldn't blame a guy for being unpleasant. So, feather in his cap, if nothing else. Those are things that I think are also important to note in this video. The last thing in terms of evidence I might submit to you is really conjecture, even more so than anything else I've presented, but as an additional point I think is worth mentioning, and that is oftentimes blacksmiths' work share some DNA, right? So if I look at Jim Hrisoulas's European stuff, and I haven't held one in hand, but if I look at photos of it and I look at the Japanese stuff, it doesn't share any DNA. There's no commonality between it. And it's not to say that there aren't, obviously there's a European sword and there's a Japanese sword. They're not going to look the same, obviously, dummy. But a lot of times if I look at smiths like Howard Clark and I look at his katana work and I look at his knife work, or Rick Barrett and I look at his katana work or his fantasy sword work or his knife work, those are smiths where I've owned their swords, their katanas, and I've owned their knives. And there's some common DNA in how they are made, common softness or harshness to lines, beefiness or subtleness. It's very, boutique-y, connoisseur-y, feely stuff. But it seems like a lot of times these products across things share some DNA, some essence of the smith. And this is just essence of Longchuan, and that's not bad. I like a number of swords from Longchuan. All of the swords that I've shown you, I've probably talked about favorably in one way, shape, or form, but all of them are substantially less expensive than this sword, and it seems disingenuous to write your name on somebody else's work and present a really terrible value for a customer. And so that's why I make these, why I'm making this video, and why I think it's important to put out. And it leaves me with this feeling that there's four options that I can come up with. And that is option A, Jim Hrisoulas is an absolutely amazing blacksmith that has somehow just been misguided a little bit. He mentioned that he looks at original pieces and is capable of replicating them, and he's replicating them in a way that is indistinguishable to me from a Chinese-made sword. And somehow Chinese-made replicas found their way into what he was examining, and he has perfectly reproduced them in a way that I can't discern from some Chinese-made piece. Again, not dogging on Chinese-made pieces, but I will say there is a very vast price difference, and also there's a pretty substantial difference to collectors and users of these swords that have Japanese-made or antique originals and Chinese-made reproductions. And that would mean that Jim, despite his PhD, despite his authorship, can't tell the difference, and I don't believe that's likely. The other possibility is that Jim is buying some swords from China and doing some amount of work that makes them objectively worse and selling them for 10 times the price, and just not being entirely transparent about that process. Maybe he gets the swords and they're not heat treated and he's doing that. Maybe, something like that, where he's adding some value debatably to the sword and I just can't see it, and it wasn't disclosed to me. Because if it is as he says, where he's manufacturing the swords, kind of the blades anyway, from start to finish in his shop, it doesn't look like that to me. But if he bought a blank, an unheat treated blade, which is maybe a dubious question for a number of consumers out there, if it's not heat treated well, you can't really rely on it. But if he gets that blank from a smith in China, heat treats it in the United States, assembles it with pieces that he can afford in China, and delivers a product, conceivably that could be of some value, but it would have to be disclosed that that is in fact what it is, and that's not at least the story that I heard. One additional possibility that I would be remiss for not including, even if it's unlikely, is that this may be a forgery of Jim Hrisoulas' work. It bears the 8R mark, and even though it looks like his mark, it could be some sort of fake. And I don't believe that's the case, because that mark looks consistent. Jim mentioned on our phone conversation that if it has that mark, it's his work, but he hasn't seen photos. Swordfin Landon did buy it secondhand, and so there is an unlikely possibility that that's the case. Now, I don't believe so. Like I said, the shape, the paint, the mark, all of it looks relatively consistent with his work. However, it could be a possibility, and it's worth throwing out there. And the final option, the fourth one, is that I could be completely wrong. I don't blacksmith anything. I'm not a PhD. I haven't written any books. I could just be a crazy, babbling, five-headed idiot on the internet that is espousing nonsense and dragging a man's name through the mud for absolutely no reason, which I would note, if I am wrong, I owe Jim an apology, and I'm happy to deliver it. I'm happy to go online and say, I'm dumb. You have shown me the proof. Cool beans. I was wrong. I would love to be wrong. That is the best possible option. But I think through the evidence that I've submitted to you here, that it is at least a very strong case that that is not what is happening. So anyway, that's what I've got. That's what I've got. And I'm sorry to make a poopy, negative, not fun video. Hopefully it's been interesting. I do want to thank Sword for Landing for sending the sword my way, which admittedly is a bit of a downside for him. He paid a substantial amount of money, and I'm effectively telling him it's not much different than a $300 sword. And I'm telling everyone that this sword is not great. So there's a potential loss for him there. I appreciate his integrity, his willingness to participate in this, knowing what I have to say about it. So anyway, that's all I've got. Hopefully it's been a helpful video. And like I said, if I am wrong, if there's other things to put on, there's an open invitation to have somebody, Jim himself, come online, talk to me, tell me I'm dumb, and for me to issue corrections. Now, if I do that, I will try to link the correction video where I'm being called stupid or anything in the notes in the description down below. So if you've made it this far, just know that I will put that there if I stand corrected, which I hope I am. That's all I've got though. Cheers, and thanks for watching.